A smile, soft, precise, like a promise repeated until it loses its meaning. I'll do it all over again, no matter how many times it takes. The line cuts like a script running on a loop. Hope, failure, reset, hope again. Homura Akemi says it as devotion, but the sequence that follows rewrites those words into something stranger. Time fractures, battles replay. Small, desperate gestures accumulate into a single, unending motion. She moves through the same days to save one person. We open on a montage, a clock hand snapping back, a classroom emptied and refilled. Homebrewers sprinting through collapsing streets while a single thought binds her. Madoka must be saved. Close up on her face, fatigue etched into bone, and older grief held in a very young mouth. There is grace in the repetition and terror in its insistence. She is both saint and prisoner of her own resolve. Homura's love for Madoka is both divine and destructive. It saves her and damns her. That paradox is the heart of what we'll explore. Psychology warns about codependency, the habit of making another's survival the architecture of yourself. Camus asks what it means to live the same life again and again. Buddhism reminds us that clinging to permanence births suffering. Today, we will trace how Homura's sacrifice folds these ideas into a single story, a pilgrimage turned prison, devotion that becomes a loop of pain. This is the paradox of love, that the refusal to let go creates its own suffering. Homura Akemi begins as a study in contrast. Kana's she is the quiet transfer student, clutching a bag, eyes lowered, presence that slips through corridors like a shadow. Under that fragile shell is motion, patient, precise, most violent in its restraint. She becomes a magical girl, not for glory or self-glory, but with a singular, coiled purpose: to protect Madoka Kanami. Her power, or her burden, is time manipulation. Mora doesn't fly into battle to win trophies. She rewinds reality. Each reset is not ornamental, 'tis labor. Each attempt folds pain into memory. Each second chance leaves new scars. What would be a tragic experience for one person becomes, for Homura, an endless rehearsal of trauma and tenderness. She learns to map catastrophe the way others learn streets, by repetition until pattern becomes habit. At first, the story reads like classic heroism. She trains, she sacrifices, she moves with a kind of obstinate grace that suggests nobility. Devotion looks noble, but devotion has a thin, sharp edge. The act of saving becomes the axis around which her life rotates. Identity in Homura's story is not something discovered or built through many roles. It narrows and hardens through duty. She wears protection like armor, and the armor hardens into a prison. The film invites sympathy. Who wouldn't admire the friend who risks everything? But sympathy slides into a different register when the mission consumes the self. Small beats tell us this: a stare held too long, refusal to speak about anything but the attempt, a calendar measured solely by resets. Her life is a ledger of versions. Homura's calendar is the loop. The loop is her witness. This is the dangerous pivot. What begins as selfless love edges into possession. Defining yourself exclusively by another's survival is a subtle erasure. The mission flattens complexity into a single line. Protect. A line is not a life. Days fold into days. Homura's contours blur. Her face becomes the emblem of the task, then the task itself. If devotion is a habit, Homura's looping is its most extreme form. Psychology gives us terms: codependency, compulsive caregiving, the martyr complex, for patterns where identity ties itself to another's survival. In those dynamics, being needed becomes proof of being. Homura intensifies that pattern into something metaphysical. Her sense of self is stitched to Madoka's fate. Each reset is its own liturgy. Change one choice, alter one moment, save her. The ritual is merciless. With each return, she repeats the same litany. One more attempt, another tiny tweak, another sacrifice. Perfection becomes an unreachable specter. Time turns into a laboratory where small experiments pile up into an archaeology of failure. Scenes that go wrong fossilize in memory. Near misses replay until they become obsessions. The loops carve grooves in the psyche, habitual channels that grow harder to leave as attempts accumulate. There's a bitter paradox baked into the design. The looping aims to close distance, to produce a timeline where Madoka lives. Yet the mechanism of rescue produces its own isolation. Homura's experiences between resets are private monuments no one else can enter. Madoka does not remember the versions where Homura lived and failed. She does not carry a ledger of substitute lives and lost years. In trying to shield Madoka from suffering, Homura constructs a solitude of knowing that separates her from the very person she vowed to protect. This maps neatly onto the martyr archetype in modern myth, the savior who cannot imagine life outside the vocation of saving. Martyrdom keeps its dignity when offered freely. It curdles into pathology when it becomes reflexive, compulsive. Homura's refusal to stop looks like courage, and yet courage presupposes choice. When sacrifice calcifies into compulsion, the self flattens into a single directive, and the interior life recedes until only mission remains. And here is the cruelest insight. Homura cannot allow Madoka to die, but she also cannot allow Madoka to live freely. To preserve someone as an object of rescue is to freeze them into a role that serves the rescuer more than the rescued. Autonomy requires risk, the vulnerability to make choices and accept consequences. Homura's project seeks certainty by eliminating risk, and in doing so, arrests the very becoming she claims to defend. The devotion that began as salvation slowly mutates into possession. In the end, the loop saves nothing whole. It preserves a possibility at the cost of living reality. With each reset, Homura adds another membrane between herself and the world, and between Madoka and the unpredictability that makes life and love genuine. A quick note before we begin. The language around eternal return shifts between philosophers. Quinta coined the idea of the eternal return as a thought experiment about living a life you'd be willing to live again and again. Albert Camus gave us the image of Sisyphus, the man condemned to roll a boulder up a hill only to watch it fall and push it again. It's a metaphor for the absurdity of repetitive existence and a test of how to live in face of it. Both thinkers give us a crucial frame for Homura's loop. Repetition is not neutral. It either becomes a crucible for meaning, or it becomes a slow crucible of despair. Homura's life is literalized philosophy. She wakes, fights, fails, rewinds, and then repeats the entire sequence, again and again and again. That is the set, an experiment in repetition that lacks the consolations most of us rely on, cumulative memories shared with others. A forward-moving narrative, the possibility that pain will yield to progress. Camus asks, what do you do when your life seems like Sisyphus's labor? His answer is paradoxical. Sisyphus is the absurd hero because he persists and finds lucidity in the persistence. He refuses the consolations of false meaning and performs his labor with consciousness. The heroic response Camus imagines is a kind of acceptance and embrace of the repetition that strips it of its tyranny. But Homura doesn't accept. She refuses to consent to the condition. Each repetition becomes not an invitation to discover cute meaning within the circle, but a battlefield where one more tweak must undo the horror she witnessed. That refusal is the hinge on which everything darkens. Instead of learning to live with the absurd, she treats the loop as a problem to be solved, a mathematical equation that, if she tries hard enough, she can balance. The consequence is exhaustion without emancipation. Repetition turns from an existential arena into an instrument of self-torment. Camus believed the ethical choice in a repetitive condition was to live with lucidity, to own the cycle and find a sense of revolt that gives life value. Camus' revolt is different. Every reset is an act of rebellion against fate, but it is also an act that denies the world its autonomy. Her resistance keeps the loop bound to her will. The existential bomb Camus offers, the possibility of finding meaning through conscious acceptance, is therefore unavailable. Her loops do not converge on peace, they spiral into a tighter grief. Every reset becomes proof of her inability to accept loss. Each iteration confirms that some losses are intolerable to her. They must be excised from history. Camus would see Sisyphus find joy in his suffering by confronting it honestly. Homura finds only more suffering. The confrontation is incomplete because she refuses the final, unbearable act, letting go. The loop becomes not a path to insight, but a monument to refusal. Buddhism gives us another lens, an ethics not of revolt, but of seeing. The doctrine of impermanence reminds us that all conditioned things arise and pass away. Clinging to what is transient becomes the engine of dukkha suffering. In this frame, love always contains a note of precariousness. To love is to risk loss. Buddhism asks you to hold love with a soft hand, not a grip that crushes the living thing you cherish. Homura's strategy is the inverse, as she tries to hold Madoka with an iron will to make permanence from a sequence of fragile, mutable events. She aims not to participate in life's flow, but to freeze a moment and make it immutable. That desire to arrest time is the spiritual antithesis of the Buddhist path, where Buddhism points to liberation through non-attachment. Homura's path becomes an elaborate form of attachment. She binds herself to a single outcome, and that binding becomes a torment. Clinging warps the very thing it seeks to protect. In her loops, Homura attempts to excise suffering from Madoka's life by removing the possibility of harm entirely. But suffering in the Buddhist sense is not merely pain, it is the refusal to accept the conditional nature of existence. When Homura tries to make love permanent, she produces a shadow world where change is punished, spontaneity is surveilled, and the beloved is reduced to a project of rescue rather than a free subject. This is why eternity without change is not bliss, but stagnation. A love petrified in time cannot breathe. Homura's intention is protective. The result is smothering. The endless resets become a psychic climate of arrested development. No growth, no surprise, no genuine autonomy for Madoka, and no inner movement for Homura beyond the single looped purpose. Buddhism would name the root, craving to know the thirst for permanence where there is none. The medicine Buddhism prescribes is not indifference, but mindful release. Love richly, act compassionately, and recognize the inevitability of loss without letting loss ossify you. Homura's tragedy is that she mistakes permanence for security. In the process, she manufactures her private heliplace, where every moment is a trap disguised as salvation. The lesson here isn't abstract, it's the practical insight that love becomes compassionate when it allows for change. To hold someone too tightly is to convert devotion into imprisonment. Homura's loop is a parable about what happens when devotion refuses the shape of life itself. Now, stitch the earlier frames together, and the pattern resolves into a paradox: the tragic martyr who becomes a destroyer. Homura begins as savior, someone willing to take the blows of fate for the sake of another. That willingness carries moral weight. Yet, the shadow side of the savior archetype is control. Jung taught that every archetype brings its shadow. The hero shadow is hubris. The caregiver shadow is possessiveness. The savior shadow is the impulse to dominate the fate of the rescued. Once the saving act becomes the rescuer's sole identity, protecting another ceases to be an offering and becomes a method of self-definition. That method requires not only action, but also erasure, the elimination of ambiguity, the removal of the beloved's agency. Homura's protection becomes a scaffolding of rules and replays designed to prevent Madoka from stepping into an unknown future. The scaffolding is comforting until it is indistinguishable from a cage. There is a moral inversion here. Love that seeks to eliminate risk does so at the cost of denying the beloved the fullness of personhood. Autonomy, with all its dangers, is the soil in which authentic love grows. By attempting to shield Madoka from pain completely, Homura removes the conditions for Madoka's growth. The devotion that once promised life now threatens to suffocate it. This is the paradox. By refusing to lose Madoka, Homura loses her own capacity to love freely. Control and protection are twin faces of the same coin when guided by fear. The more she attempts to fix fate, the less she engages the other as a subject with rights to choose. Love becomes commandeering. The very essence she sought to defend Madoka's ability to become erodes. There's also tragedy for Homura herself. The identity of rescuer narrows into a straitjacket. The inner life of a person cannot be sustained by a single project indefinitely. As the loop ossifies, Homura's selfhood withers. The cost is not only ethical but ontological. She loses her capacity for surprise, for play, for relational reciprocity. In sacrificing herself to the loop, she sacrifices the possibility of being loved in return, because Madoka refuses to love. But because Homura has traded reciprocity for relentlessly one-sided guardianship. In the end, the irony is bitter. The savior who tried to save love from loss ends up destroying love's possibility. The paradox resolves as tragedy. Protection becomes possession. Devotion becomes domination. And the act intended to preserve life becomes the very mechanism of its diminishment. At the heart of Homura's tragedy is not just her looping, not just her sacrifice, but her inability to accept emptiness. In Buddhist thought, emptiness, anyat, isn't void in the sense of nothingness. It's the recognition that everything is contingent, interdependent, passing. Loss isn't an error in a system, it is the system. And to cling against that flow is to build suffering from the raw material of love itself. Homura's tragedy is that she cannot see this. To her, emptiness is intolerable. The space left by Madoka's absence is too vast, too unbearable. And so she does what humans so often do. She tries to fill it. Fill it with loops, with plans, with a refusal so absolute that it hardens into a prison. What begins as sacrifice gradually twists into control. What begins as devotion metastasizes into imprisonment. And though she calls it love, its shape begins to resemble something else. Fear disguised as tenderness, possession disguised as care. Homura loved Madoka so much, she tried to hold her outside of time. But love frozen in eternity is no longer love. It's a cage. In this cage, both wither. Homura withers because herself dissolves into the loop. Kana withers because her freedom is denied. The beauty of emptiness, of letting love live and therefore pass, is rejected, and the rejection exacts its cost. Homura Akemi embodies the paradox of love pushed to its limit. What begins as divine sacrifice ends as destructive clinging. She saves Madoka again and again, but in doing so, she damns herself to a cycle without release. We've traced the psychological warning of codependency, a self built entirely on saving another. We've seen how Camus' eternal return becomes unbearable when resisted instead of embraced. And we've turned to Buddhism, where the refusal of impermanence transforms love into suffering. And in the end, the paradox crystallizes. Homura teaches us that love's beauty is in its fragility. When we refuse to let it end, we don't preserve it, we destroy it. To love is to let go, and to let go is to finally see the beauty of emptiness.